Chapter 4, The Vow. In January of 1967, I was sitting in my medical school dorm room, procrastinating and debating with myself whether to do more medical school studies or pursue something else. My dorm room had 10-foot ceilings and was the former jail cell for prisoners needing treatment at the Cincinnati General Hospital. The jail would send prisoners to us for medical treatment, but they needed a secure room in which to place them while getting treatment at the hospital. I was getting extremely bored that day, and instead of studying, I picked up the most recent issue of Time magazine. After reading and rereading an article on the Southeast Asia conflict, I could feel my blood begin to boil. JFK had been assassinated 4 years earlier, and the present occupant of the Oval Office seemed to have no plans to remove the U.S. from the conflict. Instead, President Lyndon Baines Johnson continued to escalate the war in Vietnam by increasing bombing raids and sending in more U.S. troops. I must admit that I found the international section of Time magazine of much greater interest than continuing to study the present chapter of biochemistry in front of me. Reading the article, I felt increasingly frustrated and angry over the escalation of the Vietnam War. The recent Christmas bombing of Hanoi and the widening conflict just fueled my anger all the more. Who did the U.S. government think they were, bombing innocent civilians over their unjustified feeling that communism was taking over the world? Over the preceding years, I had become more convinced that the civil war in Vietnam was a proxy war between the communist countries of Russia and China and the democracies of the USA and its allies. Fighting a guerrilla war in Southeast Asia was, in essence, a war between the South and its allies and the North Vietnamese and its allies. The South was anti-communist and aligned with democracies around the world, including the U.S. The North Vietnamese were aligned with China and Russia, who generally supported the communist style of government. And in my estimation, the whole mess was complicated by the military-industrial money-making complex that was one of the best, if not the best, in the world at that time. I believe that President Johnson's bombing of Hanoi, the capital of the North Vietnam, then resulted in the... Sorry, I had an interruption. I do not remember where I left off. The South was anti-communist and aligned with democracies around the world, including the U.S. The North Vietnamese were aligned with China and Russia, who generally supported the communist style of government. And in my estimation, the whole mess was complicated by the military-industrial money-making complex that was one of the best, if not the best, in the world at the time. I believe that President Johnson's bombing of Hanoi, the capital of North Vietnam then, resulted in the unconscionable and immoral deaths of Vietnamese civilians in both the North and the South Vietnam. Even as a pacifist and conscientious objector to war and violence as a means to settle disputes, I was well aware that this military engagement had not officially been declared a war by the U.S. Congress. I believe it to be a fruitless military exercise that would eventually solve nothing, not to mention it being unethical and immoral and killing a lot of civilians in the process. I also believe that many of us who held similar beliefs at the time have been proven correct by history. My stand in opposition to war and the apparent inability of violence in wars, whether declared by Congress or not, to solve anything, had become a part of my makeup since my early childhood. For several generations before I was born, my ancestors had been strongly opposed to war and violence of any kind on both religious and moral grounds. I believe that one could solve more without loss of life, injury, or property, to even mention the cost, by face-to-face communications and diplomacy. As a child at my mother's knee, I had heard her tell many stories of her grandfather's strong witness in the community against war and violence. He believed that being a peacemaker held out so much more promise for humanity. She told stories of serious threats to her grandfather because of these beliefs, threats that included being tarred and feathered and run out of town by local people during World War I, and all just for trying to be a peacemaker. Anabaptist Mennonites suffered a great deal of verbal, physical, and social abuse in that county in northwest Ohio in the earlier part of the 20th century. As my mother recounted these stories to me earlier in life, they had become a part of my heart and soul. So with those beliefs firmly entrenched in my heart and that background, I decided to go to Vietnam. Not as many of the other young men my age who had joined the military, but as a pacifist, non-combatant physician, hoping to bring some love, compassion, and healing to the people of Vietnam in their time of need. How did I come to such a life-changing decision so quickly? Besides those stories of the Southeast Asia civilian war and being told that there would be a continuing domino effect with communism taking over Southeast Asia, at least to the extent of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, it brought me an increasing intellectual dilemma. That deep-seated intellectual, emotional, and political perspective brought me to the point of making a personal vow to myself. I promised myself that if the Vietnam War was continuing when I finished medical school, I would volunteer to go to Vietnam as a non-combatant or a missionary physician to the Vietnamese people. I took the vow very seriously, with every intention of following through on it. Before this time, I had made such life decisions in more cautious, tentative manner, but this decision was a monumental leap of faith for me that I never remotely considered abandoning. By contrast to this decision, my baptismal vows were intellectually, emotionally, and spiritually more thought out and consistent with my family's expectations of what I would do with my life. This decision to go to Vietnam, however, was outside the norm for my family and much more risky at the time, marked a significant change in life direction. Much more risky and at the time marked a significant change in life direction. I have been asked about that decision to go to Vietnam many times since. Why put myself and my family in harm's way when I knew the consequences could be quite serious? Those questions are quite reasonable, but allow me to help you understand my point of view. My vow was consistent with the Mennonite Church's historical recommendations that young, healthy pacifist youth spend 2 to 3 years of voluntary service for the church before considering lifetime commitments elsewhere. Mennonite youth of that area were not so much trying to avoid military service as they were trying to use that energetic, strong, idealistic part of their life in a peaceful service to the rest of mankind. The life and death of Dr. Paul Carlson in the Republic of Congo in 1964, during those tumultuous days of the Congo Rebellion, motivated people in many countries to enter into voluntary service in situations of great need, regardless of whether they were in an area of conflict or not. In May of 1962, Daniel Gerber, working under the Mennonite Central Committee, MCC, and 2 Christian and Missionary Alliance workers, Ardell Vietti and Reverend Archie Mitchell, were abducted while serving in a leprosarium near Ban Ma Thuot, Vietnam. None of the 3 were ever heard from again and presumed dead. They are considered the longest missing civilian Americans of the Vietnam War. But all those workers had given their lives to serve in the name of Christ were in the back of my mind as I made this decision. In the Mennonite church of that era, it was generally expected that once a young man completed college or high school, they would apply for 1W status from the Selective Service System draft active at that time. Those who applied for it could meet in front of the draft board, though all weren't required to do so, and request 1W status, which meant conscientious objector performing civilian work in the national interest but not within the military. Those young men of draft age from 1948 to 1976 who were able-bodied received a A1 classification and were induced into military. One could also apply and receive a A10 classification, which would identify the young men as a conscientious objector who would serve his country as a non-combatant within the U.S. military system. During World War II, my uncle, Orville Stuckey, was a conscientious objector to war and received 1W status. He served in the Civilian Public Service program where he helped fight fires, helped police search for lost children in the hills of the Shenandoah Mountains of Virginia, and he participated in other projects here at home on U.S. soil where young, healthy men were required to replace the many young men who were overseas fighting in the military. The PACS program of the Mennonite Central Committee, Akron, PA, also had heavy participation from those classified 1W in that era. Mennonites were predominantly a rural people. MCC had over the years found ways of utilizing the many talents of these rural young men in overseas agricultural development programs. There was also the Teachers Abroad program, also run by MCC, and in third world countries, which sent college graduates as teachers to teach in underserved areas around the globe. Underserved areas around the globe. In my case, I must confess that I kept this vow a secret for a significant amount of time. I realized the promise that I had made to myself was largely contingent on MCC having a position available for a physician in Vietnam in the fall of 1969 after I completed my one-year medical internship. Thus, a lot of things needed to fall into place for me to begin to carry out that vow. When I graduated from medical school and had completed my first-year internship, I contacted MCC to inquire about openings. I was elated and somewhat relieved that they did indeed have a need and place for young physicians with my level of education and talents. After discussing it with my wife, Jeannie, it wasn't long until we were packing up with our youngest son, Jonathan, preparing to leave the friendly confines of the U.S. for an uncertain future in the war-torn Vietnam.